the development of Lent, ancient liturgies, and miscellaneous musings. Spirit Spire is starting right now.
Broadcasting from the Cathedral of the Assumption in Louisville, Kentucky, this is Spirit Spire. And now, here is your host.
Hello and welcome to Spirit Spire. I'm your host today, Erik Huff, and joined with me is my good friend and fellow co-host, Isaac Fox.
Hello, Erik.
Welcome back, everybody. Hey, Isaac, how are you?
I'm good.
Good.
It's another Fox and Huff episode.
That's right. These are some of my favorite, which were some of the last ones we've had. The Bertrand Russell one.
Yeah,
that was a lot of fun. Yeah.
We need to do a follow-up to that, too, because we only got like partway through that one, I think.
Yeah. We could pick apart a book probably for like 6 episodes worth of time, I think. Yeah.
It'd be fun, too.
Yeah. It's pretty good. That's pretty good. So how are things going for you?
Good. Very good. A lot of busyness in my life currently, so feeling a bit fatigued, but always happy to be here nonetheless. And John has a meeting, so he wasn't able to be with us today. So for our listeners, you're stuck with just the two of us for today.
Isn't there a song like that?
Just the two of us?
Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah, I think I've heard something along those
sure.
lines. Well, very good. I think today we're in the middle of Lent. We've had some really good guests recently. Yes. Deacon now, Michael Schultz.
Yes.
Dr. Peter Kraft came on. And those were fantastic experiences. But maybe it's time we actually did an episode and we started to talk about Lent.
Yes.
What it means. What are some of the traditions of the church? Maybe what are some misconceptions that people have about Lent? And just do a full Lenten spectacular episode. What do you think?
I think that's great. I know for myself, at least, I think that it's very easy to miss the heart of Lent. You know, the church enjoins on us all these practices, which are in and of themselves very good practices. Sacrifices and fasting and giving up things for 40 days and all of that. But all of those external practices are designed to lead to an interior transformation. And speaking for myself, but I expect it's probably a common human experience, I think it's easy to forget about the interior side of it and focus only on the exterior. And, you know, it's Lent. It's time for me to give up chocolate for 40 days again. And if that's the end of it, if that's all it's about, then maybe we're missing the real transformation that's supposed to happen. And yeah, I think it's be really good to maybe dive into Lent today and into the heart of Lent. What's it really about? How did we get here? How did we get these practices? Maybe look at the Bible a bit. I know you're the history guy. So a question I'm curious about, and maybe I can just ask you this right now, is what is the history of Lent? Because, you know, the various practices of the church and the various feast days of the church, many of them are very, very ancient and stem from the earliest days of Christianity, but some of them took a while to get going. And this is not a rhetorical question. I don't know. Has Lent, like the whole 40 days before Easter, has this been around from the beginning of the church? Is it later? What can you tell me about that?
Sure. I think as with most things, I think it's hard to pinpoint an exact date on when we started to celebrate Lent. But major fasts and major feasts obviously have always occurred since the beginning of the church. With Lent, it's undergone a lot of changes. So even if we did have some form of fasting leading up to Easter, it might not be so similar to Lent in its present form. It might be an archaic form of Lent. So you'll look at the church calendar in the West, and like I said, there would be fasting leading up to Easter, maybe a few weeks before. I know in the Ambrosian Rite, so that's still a Western Rite liturgy, and one of the few that survives. So if you look at the East, they still have a lot of different liturgies that they can still partake in.
Right.
But in the West, I would say around the time of Trent, probably, they all, and maybe in a natural manner, I don't think it was from top down, I don't think it was the church saying you have to conform to maybe one Tridentine or one Western liturgy. But when the Tridentine Mass and the Tridentine rubrics came about, before that in the West, liturgy was a little bit messier. So you think of the West as being the one that's really organized,
Right.
and the East as being, I don't want to say they're disorganized, but the prayers and everything that have
There's a lot more variation.
Exactly.
You've got the rite of St. John Chrysostom. You've got, all these different ones. But there was a certain top down there. I do know this much, because at the time of the Council of Trent, it was decided, because there were so many different rituals, different rites at the time, that only ones of a certain antiquity were allowed to continue.
older than 200 years.
200 years ago. I couldn't remember the date on it.
I think it was 2 centuries or older.
Right.
So yeah, because there were all these different variations. And to be completely honest, now if we looked at some of those ancient Western rites, to me anyway, I'm sure there's some really in-depth liturgical nerds out there who are going to call me out on this, but they seem so similar. And some of the rites stem from the different orders. There's the Dominican rite.
Right. Which is very close to the Tridentine.
It's so close. What are some that have kind of gone away? The rite of Braga is kind of no more. It was older than 2 centuries. So I guess this is where I was looking at kind of the top down.
Right.
A lot of Dominicans, and I think the order started to celebrate maybe later in time. Not their own rite, even before Vatican II. The rite of Braga disappeared. I think they would still be allowed to even pray that rite to this day if they're in Braga. But they've decided, decidedly, with the first liturgical change, I think a lot of the parishes fell into the Tridentine Mass. And then after 1970 and those updates, the Western Rite, I think all the rest of them have kind of, I wouldn't say abandoned, but have discontinued the actual practice of that rite.
Right. So is there a right?
Is there a right?
Is there a wrong right?
There's not. I don't know if there's a wrong right. I do know that 2 wrongs don't make a right.
And because we accept different rituals, it'd be fair to say 2 rights don't make a wrong.
That's very true. Yeah. That's very true. But what was I initially getting at there?
You were saying the difference in the Western and the Eastern rites as it relates to Lent. And you were beginning to say something about the Ambrosian rite.
Yeah, so that's...
not to be confused with ambrosial.
Yeah, so that's, I think that's coming from Milan, right? With St. Ambrose of Milan. My son's middle name is Ambrose.
Right.
After St. Ambrose of Milan, so hero of mine. But their fasts and feast days were different, and it's usually attributed, to multiple places, the when in Rome quote. Mm-hmm. But I think it was one of the traditional paraphrases of the quote. It can be accurately attributed to St. Ambrose, although in different terms.
Sure.
Is St. Augustine asking St. Ambrose, because they fast differently in Milan than they do in other parts of Italy, particularly in Rome.
Okay.
So I think that they had kind of a Sabbath Saturday and then a Lord's Day Sunday, and the whole weekend is like a feast. I don't know. I think you treat one like the Sabbath, and you treat the other like, or at least back then, you treat the other like, just a regular Sunday. It's the Lord's Day, and putting, your prayer life and so on and so forth first. And that's when Saint Augustine asked St. Ambrose, well, what do I do when I'm in Rome? And that's when he told him, well, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. And I think I was reading that in the Ambrosian rite, because Paul VI, I think, was the Archbishop of Milan.
Okay.
I don't know if they have a patriarch like Venice. I don't know. But I think he was the Archbishop of Milan. And because of that, he knew the Ambrosian rite well.
Gotcha.
So when Vatican II happened, maybe some of these older more ancient rites, older than 2 centuries at the time of the Council of Trent, which was in the 1500s, right?
Right.
Right.
I'm gonna stop saying that. It's such a habit of mine.
Yeah, those rites, like I said, fell by the wayside, but I think the Ambrosian rite didn't, because we had a pope at the time of the liturgical reforms who was from Milan, was the Archbishop of Milan. I could just be making this up and remembering this wrong. But so those feast days and those fast days, I think, are celebrated differently.
In the Ambrosian rite, even today.
Even in Lent. And I don't know if Ash Wednesday, I could be wrong. I'd love for somebody to look into this who's more knowledgeable than I am. But I don't think Ash Wednesday was always celebrated as part of Lent. I don't know if that started in 1970 or the 1500s or when it became a part, or the very official start day of Lent. I think that in the Ambrosian rite, it still starts on that Sunday.
Okay.
Maybe that Saturday because of how they feast. I don't know.
Right, but not on the Wednesday. So kind of what I'm getting from this is, if we're going to look at the history of Lent, and especially when we look in the early centuries of the church, we're not going to have maybe the easiest evidence to find. It's not like there's a liturgical handbook from AD 250 that says on this particular day, we decided to start the fast of Lent. But what we would be looking for is, and it may vary in number of days. Did it start on Ash Wednesday? Did it start after the first Sunday of Lent? But what we would be looking for, and it seems there is sort of a universal commonality here, is a period of fasting prior to Easter that was associated with Easter. In other words, it's not just like a random fast for some other reason, but rather a period of fasting that's designed to be preparatory to the celebration of Easter. And that, I suspect, we probably find pretty early in the church and pretty universally. Yeah,
and a lot of people get hung up on changes, liturgical changes. Even the concept of development. I think sometimes people, it can be painful, I don't know, to them. And they've got personal attachments and devotions associated with these sorts of things. So when we look at a development of a liturgy, we didn't have, at one time, it wasn't even decided what the 7 sacraments were. And I think there's a point when we knew there were 7 of them, but we didn't know which 7 of them, were sacraments. And, is it a different sacrament to become a bishop than to become a priest? I think that there were 7 holy orders.
Interesting.
So all of these things in the church.
It takes time to sort out.
Right. And you have to look at one hand, it's antiquarianism to go back and say, the earlier it is, the better. Because the church develops, I've heard people say this, like, the church develops, so, you're not going to feed a baby solid food.
Right.
You're not going to feed a grown adult breast milk.
Right.
So likewise with the church, there has to be this development, and it has grown. Cardinal Newman talks about how...
Just where my mind was going, too.
Cardinal Newman talks about how we've had this larger church up until his time period in the 19th century, that the church throughout time and this development and looking at it, it's actually easier to believe the faith now than at the time of Christ, because we've seen it, develop, the theologies are better understood. Yeah.
Gotten cleaned up, in a sense.
And we've seen a ton of miracles. Yeah. We've seen a lot of saints. We've seen a lot of martyrs. We've seen a lot, and the fact that the faith exists up until his time period, 1,800 years, and now 2,023 years into the future is a really good sign that, hey, there might be something about this Christianity business.
Under normal human terms, it should not have lasted this long. It's certainly not identifiably.
Right.
And my mind was going to Newman as well, and just an encouragement that I would make for anybody listening is to read Cardinal Newman's Development of Doctrine if you haven't done so, because the fact that developments will happen is probably the most natural thing in the world.
Yeah.
You take a text, you read the text then needs interpretation, and that may need further
I thought you were going to say
understanding.
the text reads you, and then I thought that would be scary. All
That
right.
would be pretty scary. Yeah. We expect development everywhere in life. We see in the Bible Jesus referring to the kingdom of heaven as a grain of mustard seed, and eventually it grows into this large, this tree, basically. We see humans develop from infants, from embryos to full-grown adults. Everything grows and develops. So that's to be expected. The point to Cardinal Newman's essay on the development of doctrine is not so much that we should expect to find things developing, but it is, how do we distinguish when the development is authentic as opposed to being something totally new, totally different, or corruption of the original deposit of faith? And what is the real genius of that work, again, is not so much to prove that developments are likely to happen, but that he basically creates a science, a template. It's like doing DNA testing, to where you look at a doctrine which is a more contemporary development, and you have his rules of the science to apply to it and say, okay, is this an accretion or corruption? Or can we find the DNA that it came from the original seed 2,000 years ago?
Right.
And that's a real genius that works. I really would recommend that. But I wanted to...
Are you just taping a branch onto the tree after the fact?
Right, exactly. It's like, okay, this church has existed for however many thousand years, and one day somebody comes along and says, hey, new doctrine. We're all going to start believing X now. And Newman would say, no, that doesn't come from anything we already believed. It doesn't come from the initial deposit of faith.
It's not from the deposit of faith.
Right, whereas he points out that we could look at something...
What is the deposit of faith? You want to explain that? It's kind of a math problem, right?
Yeah, so the deposit of faith would be the revelation that Jesus Christ gave to his apostles. So Christ would be the ultimate revelation. We look at the history prior to that, the Jewish religion, and perhaps we can even look at non-Jewish peoples that receive certain levels of revelation from God. I'm personally very inclined to think that some of the great Greek philosophers had some inspiration.
I've seen in yes, to that point, I think it's Aristotle. If you go to St. Vincent Ferrer in New York City in the Upper East Side, he has like a green halo. Like everybody else has gold halos.
Like
I think
pagan saint.
it might even be square. Yep. I don't remember, but he has some form of a halo that's not quite a saintly halo.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and honestly,
Virgil, and of course, Virgil is great about not Virgil, Dante.
Yeah,
he's using people like Virgil in the Divine Comedy, obviously considering them to have been good pagans. But so we have the coming of Christ.
The Aeneid is like a classic of Christian literature. That's not Christian at all in most circles.
There is something about a number of those pagan philosophers and writers that do seem to work very well, mesh very well with Christianity.
Yeah.
But with Christ coming, we have the fullness of revelation. I think all Christians, Catholic or not, agree with that. This is the ultimate revelation.
Absolutely.
It's not a revelation in part, because it is the revelation of God himself, by God himself, in the person of God himself, basically, right? This is the ultimate revelation. But the greatness of God is too much for us to grasp.
Sure.
So, yes, Christ is God, so we have this full revelation through Christ, but no single human mind and in no short lifespan is going to be able to grasp that. And so Christ leaves what we call the deposit of faith. He makes this revelation to everybody around him, but principally to his 12 apostles.
Sure.
And I'm glad you asked the question, because I think this is a very important point. There's often a point of tension or debate between Catholics and Protestants on this point. Because on the one side, we frequently find the doctrine of sola scriptura, right? We're going to accept the Bible only as this source of revelation.
What's the traditional line you hear? The Bible says it, I believe it, and that settles it.
Yeah. And Catholics are well known that we accept, of course, the teaching authority of the magisterium, but I'm talking about where we get the information from. We accept the Bible and what we call sacred or apostolic tradition.
Sacred
tradition with
scripture.
a capital T.
And sacred tradition.
Right. And so we have this, there's historically been this kind of debate or tension between the two. And I think that one of the things that gets missed here, maybe on both sides, is the Catholic emphasis on sacred tradition. It's not really like it's Bible plus tradition.
Yeah.
Right. See, I think even sometimes as Catholics, we fall into that way of thinking or defending the position that way. The reality is that the revelation was delivered to the apostles, to 12 men. And that's why we call it apostolic tradition.
And Christ could have written a book, right?
And he
had
never
enough
did.
time, 33 years to write a book.
The only thing Christ ever wrote that we're aware of is some words in the dust of the ground when the woman was caught in adultery.
Yeah.
And that's interesting because people always debate over what that meant, why he did that, because John draws attention to it, but then doesn't tell us what he wrote.
What did it say? Yeah.
There is a passage in the Old Testament, though, and I think it's referring to people's death. But I think it's interesting because it says something along the lines, and this is referring to people who are opposed to God, the names of those who hate you are written in the dust of the ground. It's kind of interesting. One wonders, right?
Yeah.
But the point I'm making is it wasn't Bible or tradition. It wasn't Bible and tradition. It was apostolic. That's the key. Jesus reveals himself to the apostles, then he gives them the Holy Spirit. They are the nucleus, the seed, the church of the infant church, right? And so he gives them his revelation, his Holy Spirit. So that's why we call it the apostolic deposit of faith. But then how they choose to relay that is going to be both in writing and word of mouth. So that's where we kind of get the two streams. But I think we need to remember that it's just the apostolic deposit of faith. And the reality is the scriptures, and you pointed this out on another podcast, are actually part of apostolic tradition.
Right.
That's the key thing to recognize there.
So for them to be in the canon, it had to originate from an apostle.
And it had to be part of the oral apostolic tradition to know that these came from apostles.
And it also had to be used in a liturgy.
That's a great point, which, let me just kind of circle back here. You were talking about the development of liturgy, and of course we began by talking about Lent, which I think we're still going to be talking about, but this is a great little tangent that this is taking.
Yeah, sure, no.
Let's talk about the Didache for a moment.
Yeah.
So the Didache, if anyone watching or listening is not familiar with this, it's a very early Christian document. It would be considered the earliest Christian document that is outside of the New Testament.
People always pronounce it wrong too. You hear a lot of
Didache.
Didache, yeah.
Didache. It's a Greek word, means the teaching, and the long form of that is the teaching of the 12 apostles. Probably, or perhaps not actually composed by the 12 apostles. Some people have claimed that over time, but many people claim the opposite.
I think Penguin has it in. They might just have it by itself, but I think that there's an early Christian writings book that you can get, and it is excellent. It has that. It has the letters of St. Ignatius
of Antioch, yeah.
And then it has the martyrdom of Polycarp.
Justin Martyr's Apologies, maybe.
I don't think it's that thick. I don't think it gets that far, but it's pretty good. So I would recommend to any Christian to pick up a copy of that early Christian writings and take a look.
It's good to know the roots. It's good to see what the early church was doing. So the Didache is difficult to date precisely, but I think the vast majority of scholars for a long time are going to date it to the first century of Christianity. And there are a number of good scholars who would date it actually potentially pre-AD 70, pre-destruction of the temple.
Okay. I did not know that.
Now, and just like you said earlier, I stand to be corrected on that. I believe that is the case.
Yeah, I was here like a 103 or 108.
Yeah, so I could be wrong on that, but I believe I've heard that there are some that date it that early.
Yeah, I've never heard anything to the contrary. So
what I will say this on that point is, and this may be a confusion, the first letter of Clement, of Pope Saint Clement.
That's in the early Christian writing book too.
Right, that is there. I do know for a fact that there are some scholars that think that could have been pre-AD 70, and there's some very good reasons for that. Whereas it's usually dated like 80 to 100, roughly. I think isn't 90 usually the rough date given for Clement?
So let's kind of talk about, let's talk about the importance of that time frame.
Yeah.
And why that's spectacular. I think...
Erik, why is that time frame important?
I think it's good because it shows, it's closer to our Lord and that his death and resurrection. I've seen a ton of apologists over the years talk about, and maybe this is the first time somebody listening has heard this, but I'm almost certain it isn't. Of course, they would write things down a little bit later as they got closer to their death because they realized, hey, I'm old and I'm going to die.
Right.
Because they had full anticipation that Christ was going to return within their lifetime.
Look how long John took to write his gospel.
Yeah. So they clearly make sense that it would be written either on their deathbeds by their followers or by the person in question themselves. So to have these really early Christian writings is so beautiful and so edifying. I think they found Mark is always considered to be the oldest gospel,
Correct.
I think. But there was no tangible evidence of that. I think that the oldest manuscript might have been from John,
Maybe
JS something in or Matthew, and it's in the UK in a museum, and it's a fragment. But then they found, when they like stuff mummies.
I've heard this.
They found a few years back they had stuffed a mummy, with paper, you paper mache it, and they found an ancient fragment of Mark that might be the oldest biblical fragment to exist.
I've heard that. That's really cool. But I think this is really important because you are closer to the time of Christ. You're also, in a number of these writings, you are within the apostolic age. And 2 or 3 of these writings can very likely have fallen while one of the apostles, namely St. John, was actually still alive.
Sure.
And so we do get a picture of the early infant church. And now I'm going to go back and look up the Didache dating stuff to make sure that I'm not crazy about that.
You are crazy, but not about
I'm crazy, maybe not about that. I do think that there are some scholars that date it from potentially the 80-70 before. But they are the minority. If I am right about that, I do know that would be the minority.
Yeah.
But if we're in that even 80 to 100 zone,
Sure.
we're very, very early on. And the Didache, as said, it means the teachings, and it teaches quite a lot of things. But one of the things that it does is it talks a bit about the liturgy.
Yeah.
And it also talks about fasting, to our point.
Yeah.
And so I kind of wanted to bring these two things up.
Yeah.
You were talking about development of the liturgy. So we have in our liturgy these prayers, the canon of the Mass, right, that has been written down, and the priest or the bishop is supposed to adhere to this very strictly.
Yeah.
And we know that many of these are very, very ancient. In fact, the Second Vatican Council, with the changes it made, these weren't necessarily new things. Many of these were actually going back to more ancient forms of liturgy.
Some of them debatedly so. Boyer said that the ones that he wrote, that I think it's Eucharistic prayer number 2, that canon he only very barely took it from the ancient liturgy.
Oh, really?
I forget what was the prayer? I think it starts with an H.
I don't know.
I can't remember, but it was from an ancient liturgy, but he wrote it on a napkin. And if you read Boyer's memoirs,
Okay.
he had like a really quick time crunch, and he wrote it on the back of a napkin at dinner and gave it to his secretary, who forwarded that one over really quick.
Wow. But there's some connection with
But it is an ancient, it is from an ancient prayer. And Boyer is a great liturgist.
Yeah.
So they had the right man for the job there.
Well, one of the things that we encounter here is that the priest prays over the bread and the wine prior to the consecration. This is important over the bread first. Blessed are you, Lord God of all creation. Through your goodness, we have this bread to offer you, fruit of the earth and work of human hands. It will become for us the bread of life. Right, and then over the cup, after mixing the water with the wine, he prays, blessed are you, Lord God of all creation. Through your goodness, we have this wine to offer you, fruit of the vine and work of human hands. It will become our spiritual drink. And after both of these, the congregation replies with, blessed be God forever.
Right.
These are actually Jewish prayers.
Yeah, I don't know the age of those barakas, the meal blessing prayers.
Yeah, so they are, the idea of baraka, those precise prayers, I don't know the age of them, but
We've talked about this.
The idea, the baraka prayers, the blessing, is itself very ancient, even pre-Christian. Well, when we look at the Didache, it offers prayers that the bishop or priest is supposed to pray over the gifts. And they're different than those, but the theme is very interesting because you can see a similarity, and you can see the sort of the Jewish baraka roots.
Yeah.
So I can't quote these, but it's something about over the bread. It's something to the effect of, as these grains were once scattered over the hillsides and brought together, may you, O God, bring your people together. Right, and then there's another prayer over the cup. So there certainly is these ideas of prayers over the elements all the way back to the earliest days of Christianity, and they do seem to have a Jewish connection to Passover and other liturgical meal prayers of the Jews. But what is interesting is,
which, I mean, I look at, and I'm sure this is some way theologically correct, in some way just in my own imagination, but I mean, the development of the church it's very clearly developed from the ancient Jewish religion.
Absolutely.
I mean, there's so many direct parallels and typologies. I'm thinking too,
and it should be, right? It's the fulfillment of what God had been slowly revealing over time.
I'm thinking about the even just sackcloth and ashes.
Going back to Ash Wednesday.
Yeah, and just the idea. I think that in the development of Ash Wednesday, is it started with, if you were in sin and you were fulfilling your penance, you were a penitent.
Yeah.
You wore sackcloth and ashes.
Yeah.
And that's developed from the Old Testament. I can't remember all of the passages, but I'm at least thinking of Nineveh.
Yeah.
And Jonah, and and the king himself sitting in sackcloth and ashes. Did the animals have to have sackcloth and ashes?
Yes, something along those lines.
Yeah. So,
some sort of penance that the animals had to do.
And I mean, even in the earlier church, we were just talking about how I said there wasn't a lot of clarity on all the different the offices of the church. There used to be 7. Now we have bishop, priest, and deacon.
Right.
And I think that they have the instituted orders that are a little different than the traditional usage of lector and acolyte, but they had porter. And I mean, what was the porter's job? Well,
we're not talking about the dark beer, right?
No. I wish. Just the beer.
There's water in here.
The Lenten observance of monks that just drink beer.
Yeah.
All of dark beer. Oh, that sounds good. Right now, until you get a hangover on the second day and have to drink more.
I can't even imagine.
More beer. But the porter, not the dark beer.
Right.
The porter. I mean, what's the job of a porter?
Isn't he the guy that opens doors?
He opens doors. You think of a porter. Father Martin was it porter was the word he used during his interview on here? He used it in a different way. It's like someone taking the things to the car, and I've heard it in that context too. It's kind of
like at hotels.
Like a transportation thing, a little bit different than like a doorman.
But I think the porters at hotels are frequently at the door when you arrive with your luggage, right?
Yeah. So the porter in the context of the early church, which I'm sure all of these kind of derive from the same thing. The porter in the early church's job was to see the people in their sackcloth and ashes. And they know they're not supposed to be there for the liturgy of the Eucharist. So they would kick the unbaptized and the penitents out of the church when it switched from the it's not the They wouldn't have used the term liturgy of the Eucharist in the liturgy of the
Word. But it would have been at that point.
It would have been that
after the liturgy of the Word. before
after
liturgy of
the
Eucharist.
traditional liturgy of the Word. What did they call it in pre-1970? Was the Mass of? There's two different masses. It was called the Mass
I don't know.
of. Oh, it might have been like the Mass of the Catechumens
Catechumens,
or
that's what I was
something.
gonna
At one
ask,
time,
yeah.
and then the Mass of the Faithful or something.
Right. Well, one of the things, just real quick, jumping back to Didache, is that some of the other prayers, or this part of the prayers of Mass, it also says something to the effect of, but allow the prophets to pray as they wish, or something along those lines. And then there's another early Christian writer, maybe it's like Hippolytus or something, which also speaks.
I think that's the one that we were talking about with Boyer.
Okay.
That was the one where Eucharistic prayer number 2.
Okay.
I think it's based off of that one.
There was a fantastic, it's totally off the subject. There was a wonderful priest years ago here in Louisville, before you moved here. And he was an older priest, very white hair, had a very rich oratorical voice, and he was a great priest. But I remember his voice. It was very rich, very distinctive. He had a real bearing about him, and the white hair, and it was like the Gandalf.
Yeah,
right?
that's what I was going to say.
And the funny thing, though, was he would always read the part that said Eucharistic prayer. So when he would get to that part, I'll never forget this. It would always be like, Eucharistic prayer number 4, and then he would start reading. It was just very amusing.
That's a good way to learn which Eucharistic prayer is which.
But the point I was making about, I think it's Hippolytus, has a very similar thing in his writings, which, again, this is looking at very early Christianity, where he's giving a certain element of structure, and he cautions for those who are praying their own words to be cautious about. Apparently, there was some issues with people kind of making up the prayers and sliding into some less than orthodox statements in their prayers. But we do have this idea.
It doesn't happen now, ever.
Never.
I've never seen that
no.
at a Catholic Mass.
But I think there is this idea that in a very early church, we really do have this development of liturgy, like you were saying earlier. There is an initial structure. There's that seed form, to go back to Newman's idea. And very early on, even in the Didache, we do have the ideas of some actual prayers being there. The Holy, 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 the Sanctus, that seems to go back possibly to the very beginning.
Thrice Holy Prayer, yeah.
The Trisagion. The little back and forth of lift up your hearts, we lift them up to the Lord. That seems to go back almost to the very earliest days of Christianity. Yeah. But there were also areas where, and in the actual canon, where the priest or bishop could just make up their own prayers, right? And that seems to have lasted for a short period of time before there was this need to sort of codify it, to avoid irreverence, to avoid heresy, perhaps.
Was it not until the 1500s that there was a strict manual on it? I really don't think there was.
I don't know, but I do know that there are, liturgies, liturgy documents that date back to like the 200s or so, I think.
Sure, yeah.
Right, that are at this point fairly strict. Not the.
That would be before the canon, like the canon of scriptures fully.
Yeah, which is interesting. But this would have been allowing already a lot less room, I think, for personal expression. The other thing that is interesting in Didache is it has a little thing about fasting. And this is where I meant to go a long time ago.
Yeah.
And I actually have always found this amusing. The Pharisees apparently fasted on 2 days out of the week. And I don't know if you remember this passage better than me. I'm probably going to be wrong, but I'm going to say that they fasted on Tuesday and Thursday.
Okay.
And the Didache says, do not be like the hypocrites. They're using the scriptural term for the Pharisees there. Do not be like the hypocrites who fast on Tuesday and Thursdays, but let your fast be on Wednesdays and Fridays. And there is something, I think if you read it one way, it's kind of amusing. It's like, you're calling them hypocrites because they pick those 2 days, and then you're fine because you picked 2 other days.
Yeah, right. You just switched which 2 days.
But I think if the Didache is as early as we may think, when a lot of early Christianity was still Jewish,
Right.
my guess would be this was probably more of a way to distinguish oneself from the Jews as far as your public practices went. But what it does tell me is that fasting...
It would have to be after 90 AD when they're excommunicated from the synagogue.
And see, there may be a valid point to date it later.
What was the second Jewish revolt? What was his name?
Was it Bar Kokhba?
Bar Kokhba.
Yeah, Simon, right? Simon Bar Kokhba?
I think that's really where you see a major shift, and that's probably one of the earliest schisms, right?
Yeah.
This is between the regular Jewish religion and Christianity as its own religion, because before it was just Judaism.
It was. You see the early Christians still meeting in the synagogues. They anticipate this as a fulfillment of Judaism.
In the Bible, yeah, they're meeting in the synagogue. In the New Testament. Mm-hmm. But there were two types of Jewish people during that second Jewish revolution, and that half were the ones who want to fight, and then there's the ones who really don't want to fight. Obviously, the ones who want to fight are going to win because they're scrappier, they're fighters. Sure. But at that point, they believed that Bar Kokhba was the Messiah.
Right.
So if you are a Jewish person who believes in Christ, you're unable to affirm Bar Kokhba as the Messiah because the Messiah has already come to Christians. So they kind of fall. That's really, I think, a lot.
So they were the pacifists?
A lot of, they're kind of lumped in with them.
Right.
Because they can't fight
under Bar Kokhba, or not recognizing him as the Messiah.
Right. So that's a really strong point. And I'm pretty sure that they were getting kicked out of the synagogues prior to that. But I think a lot of historians and religious scholars really put that instance around 90 to, 110 or something.
Somewhere in there, yeah.
I think that's really the great split between the two.
And that may not be the reason for that line in the Didache, but it certainly, seems possible. At any rate, I find it amusing, that don't do the Thursday fast, do the Wednesday, Friday. But
Wednesday, Friday is way better.
I think one of the takeaways of that, though, for me, is to realize how much more fasting there was in the early church.
Yeah.
Like, this is an enjoinder for, ordinary Christians to do 2 fasts a week. That's a lot.
And they're kind of, our fasts now, too,
are not really what they would have called fasts.
Yeah, they're not.
We're like 1 meal only on Ash Wednesday and Good Friday, plus 2 snacks, provided that doesn't, add up to a full second meal.
Yeah.
And it's...
we get snack time. I always make fun of, at the school I'm at, the 8th graders get snack time.
Yeah.
I think that's hilarious. Coming from public schools, like, we quit getting snack time in, first grade. Like, kindergarten, we had snack. First grade, we did not have snack. But we have up to 8th grade. It's kind of like that with our fasting. Yeah. We get some snack time in there.
And, there's a lot to be said on both sides. There's a lot to be said for more sacrifice and more strictness.
Yeah.
There's a lot to be also said for the fact that many people are not in a place to, in their jobs, in their spiritual development, physically, emotionally, anything to be able to handle that. So there's a need for being softer and more merciful as well.
Sure.
And I think that is something that does take a lot of time to begin to balance and sort of sort out. Plus, I think that we're different people and we live in a different era. I think if you were Jewish and you were accustomed to those fasts and you became Christian, well, it makes sense to sort of continue with them. Whereas, we might be kind of a little softer culture here in the 21st century. I get the shakes if I haven't eaten for a few hours and had too much coffee. And, I'm like, what? I can't imagine the idea of doing a week on bread and water.
Well, let me ask you this. So, we talked about Nineveh in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
Do you know if Jewish people at that time, is there a sense of, you're just fulfilling the law with these fasts? Or is there this sense of penance already built into their fasting?
So that brings up something I actually wanted to mention when you started talking about the Old Testament roots of this. The short answer, I think both. I would say both. There are certainly examples of individuals doing the whole ashes and sackcloth bit, where it clearly is not a matter of fulfilling the law. They've chosen to do it on their own because that's where their hearts are at. So I've mentioned Dr. Brant Petrie a number of times on the show, and I swear he's not paying me to keep mentioning him.
Yeah,
but,
I know. Yeah, well, if he isn't now, he should be in the future.
Right. Yes, if you're listening, Dr. Petrie. No, but he has on YouTube.
What was the book he wrote recently with? Is it Dr. Bergsma at?
I don't know, but Dr. Bergsma is fantastic as well.
They did an Old Testament book, and I've read some excerpts from it.
I should wonderful. Get that. That's got to be great.
Yeah, he's got a video. Maybe they both can pay us.
Excuse me. Or they could just both come and be on the show.
Yeah,
that would be lovely too.
That's right.
So he has a YouTube video called "The Biblical Roots of Ash Wednesday."
Okay.
And in it, he starts making the point that you were making about a number of the Old Testament cases of sackcloth and ashes, including ashes on the head. And he brings up Esther. So in the book of Esther, there's a period of time where her people, the Jewish people, are going to be slaughtered. They've been lied about. They're going to all be killed. And it's up to her to go and petition the king on their behalf. And she...
Is that Haman?
Yes.
Yeah.
Or wait, Haman wasn't the king. Haman was the liar, right?
The liar guy, yeah.
And so she is greatly distraught. And she goes into this period of prayer and penance. And so Dr. Brant Petrie brings this up on the video, and I know this story. I did not remember this detail from the Bible.
Yeah.
So I think she does sackcloth. She gets rid of all of her finery, and she puts ashes and dung on her head.
No way.
Both. Yeah, this is pretty extreme. And his comment was...
I think they're updating our rite for next year to include the dung, yeah.
Yeah, well, that was what Dr. Petrie said. He's like, we have to appreciate the church's wisdom in only going with ashes, because I think that Dung Wednesday would not be quite as popular as Ash Wednesday has been.
I've got a better name for it, but I'm not going to say it on here.
So that... on that note, that might be a good time to take a short break. We can all be very grateful, though we have to do some penances this time of year, that it does not involve starting off with a Dung Wednesday.
Yeah. All right, so that'll conclude this segment on Spirit Spire. We'll be back in just a second.
Hey everyone, another sponsor for today's episode is the Cathedral of the Assumption in the heart of downtown Louisville, Kentucky. It is the spiritual center of parish and family life and is a historic treasure for the Catholic Church in America. Take a tour or consider visiting for Mass. Check them out at cathedraloftheassumption.org.
All right, welcome back to more Spirit Spire on our Lenten special that has turned into Mr. Toad's Wild Ride.
Yes.
We've gotten off the rails quite a bit, but I think it has had a general Lenten arc. So continuing with what little bit of sanity, little bit of Lent we've put in there. I kind of wanted to we've talked about the ashes, we've talked about the penance, we've talked a lot about the liturgy, we've talked a lot about other stuff.
Yeah.
Let's talk about those 40 days. I know you brought it up in the beginning.
Yeah.
And we spoke about how it wasn't always 40 days, that's a development. But let's talk about some of the theology of why the church, in her wisdom and in her tradition, may have wanted it to be 40 days, to set it at 40 days of Lent.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I
think it's actually 44 days, but...
Well, if you go from Ash Wednesday. Right?
Yeah, I think on a technicality.
But but the symbol there is 40. And I'd love to get your thoughts on this. I have a couple of thoughts I'll share with real quickly. 40 is very scriptural.
Sure.
We see the number 40 appearing a lot in the Bible. And a few examples that I would point out would be the 40 years that the Israelites spend in the desert, in the wilderness. Elijah does a stint of 40 days out in the desert.
Yep.
And of course, Jesus has his 40 days of temptation in the wilderness. We just had that gospel passage.
Which I think maybe it's a gospel passage, but maybe it's a variety of other things in the tradition, but I think that's the one that gets pinpointed the most,
for
that I hear the most.
Why the 40 days of Lent, yeah. So there's some other 40 days too, but those three share some interesting commonalities, and I would just
The $40 I have left to my name.
right.
Sorry, no, that's
that
not
much.
one.
Wow,
That's not one of them.
But no, I'd kind of like to point out two or three things that I think are connect those three that I just mentioned.
Yeah.
So the 40 years that the children of Israel spend, the 40 years, life expectancy would be a little less than, and we know that none of the original generation survived to enter the promised land.
Yeah.
So we could look at this as a lifespan, as a generation,
Yeah.
those 40 years. And it's 40 years between 2 points. One is Egypt, which roughly represents the world.
Yeah. Very
And so
worldly.
it's not a fun place because it's bondage, and we would say now bondage to sin and slavery. But we also remember they apparently like the food a lot.
Yeah, they're always talking about it.
Yeah, so it seems that in spite of their misery, there was some satisfaction to the flesh to be had there, right? And then on the far other side is the promised land, which we would view as paradise or heaven.
Yeah.
So in the middle, we've got this lifespan of these 40 years of God's people. They've been removed from the world, but they haven't yet made it to heaven. So there's this wilderness of trials and temptations and learning and all this they have to pass through. So the first commonality across these three is the wilderness. The desert, but that may not necessarily be a sandy desert. I think it's the wilderness.
Right.
So that would be the first thing in common that we see in these three stories I just mentioned. The second thing is interesting because when we look at Jesus' temptation, he has a direct encounter of a very negative kind with the devil himself.
Right.
And we remember the story that Jesus tells about a man who has had a demon cast out of him. And the demon, it says, travels through waterless places. And then it finds more of its own kind, goes back to the man, and it says the second state of that man was worse than the first.
Yeah.
And I believe that this is part of a Jewish tradition of this idea that the devils lived in the wilderness, right? That was kind of their abode.
I still buy it.
And well, I don't know that they're more present in the wilderness than in cities, but and actually that's the point I kind of want to get to, so I'll just hold that thought for a moment. When we look at Elijah, we don't see the devil or a demon attacking him, but he does say that he just wants to die. He's facing despair and hopelessness. He's like, just let me die. I'm no better than my fathers. Well, that's kind of a demon, right? That demon of despair.
Sure.
I think that's probably one of the worst, the thing that makes us want to actually give up and not continue with this path we're on.
And I mean, we have an okay development of theology on angels.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say the older the book in the Bible, and I don't mean chronologically back to Genesis, but maybe time periods it's written, might go a little historical critical there.
Yeah.
Maybe Job is the oldest.
Sure.
That sort of thing. But I would imagine that with each of these successive writers that are divinely inspired, that their theological understanding of angels and demons, and even to the prophets, might not be as developed. You might not know that you're facing spiritual warfare in the same manner in the desert.
Well, right, like we see Jesus talking about guardian angels, but that was an idea that has certainly developed in Judaism. That's not clear in some of the older eras. And then when we look at the 40 years in the desert, we see, here's the people of God. They have the presence of God dwelling with them on Mount Sinai. We're in the tabernacle. They've got Moses, who's basically like the Messiah in type, directly delivering the words and laws of God, and yet they still fall into idol worship. And they also get attacked by pagan tribes, isn't it? Amalek, I believe. So you again have these attacks, these temptations to idolatry. So this is the second commonality, is something of the forces of evil in this desert experience.
Evil.
Very creepy, Erik. Thank you for that. When I think of Lent and the desert, one of the first things that comes to my mind is going to be the Desert Fathers.
Yeah, I was going to say, I was thinking of St. Anthony of the Desert. Yeah.
And that was exactly
Anthony
where
Abbot.
I wanted to go, is we would think a man like St. Anthony, he gives up everything he has. He runs the desert to become a hermit and later becomes pretty much the founder of monasticism.
Yeah.
You would think a man like that would be free from temptation. He's left the world completely behind. There's no body. There's no, possibility we would think of him being attracted to, say, temptations of the flesh.
Well, I want to
or
point
of
out
riches.
I
or
want to
any
point
of this.
out there. I remember I was at a vacation Bible school, Southern Baptist growing
Yeah.
up, and I remember there was like a recording or something we had to listen to, and one of the kids on there, it's so obnoxious to think about now, but it was a great vacation Bible school, spiritually speaking. But this one recording stands out to me. It said, "Man, it's hard not to sin. Why don't I just, get a tent and go out and live in the desert somewhere where there's not a lot of people around me to not sin?" And I remember thinking, hey, that sounds like a heck of an idea.
Yeah.
Why doesn't somebody try that, though? But for real. And I couldn't think
Then
of
you
it.
found out it's been tried.
And then I'm like, oh, tried and true to some extent with monasticism. But it's also just because you go into the desert
It's not an escape.
doesn't mean those temptations.
And St. Anthony, as we know, to bring that point, faced a period of extreme temptation and basically had war with the devil, in the desert. And this is not just St. Anthony. This seems to be something of a commonality with the Desert Fathers. They're very keenly aware of the reality of spiritual warfare.
What is it? Which one of the Renaissance painters? Is it Michelangelo that has the St. Anthony in the desert, and you can barely see him because like all the demons have him like lifted up the ground, and there's just
I have not seen
all
that.
these monkeys on his back. I've seen that. What's the other one? Oh, well, I've seen one in oh gosh, what's the capital of Canada?
Is it Ontario or Ottawa?
No, it's in Ontario. Oh gosh,
Ontario is not the capital. So
Ottawa. Is it Ottawa?
Or is it Toronto? Did I say Ontario? I think I'm
No.
Toronto or Ottawa. Isn't it one of those two?
Is Ottawa the capital?
I'm now officially looking really unintelligent on.
I'm very tired.
on
I'm
audio.
sorry. Well, I was there and I can't remember what it's called. So I was in Ottawa,
Sure.
the capital of.
It may not be the capital, but it's Ottawa.
Well, I think wherever I was the capital.
Oh, okay.
Okay. No, it's so embarrassing. But anyways, they had a depiction, like a whole room full of St. Anthony of the Desert. My favorite of which is like, it was like some artist, his patron. So like he's in the depiction and, St. Anthony's just like standing there with his hand on, this is common, but standing there with his hand on his back. We've got a painting similar to that in the room across from us, but, he's just like standing there and he's like, and St. Anthony's like, yeah, it's all good. I'm here, bro. I got your back.
Yeah.
Yeah, Ottawa.
Because he's been through it. But I think that seems to be something of a commonality with like the Desert Fathers. And so I guess one of the thoughts that occurs to me there is, if you compare the wilderness to, let's say, the city, we think of the city, as a place more potential for sin and corruption and violence and degradation, all of that. So I wouldn't say that there is less demonic influence away from that, away from the city. But I think that it is very possible that one's awareness of it is greater when you're no longer so distracted by the things of the world, both the presence of God and the presence of the devil. Then I think things are stripped away. Yeah. And you become more aware that these aren't just things and distractions. There is a real spiritual force behind them. Plus, those who do plunge into the wilderness in order to follow God more closely are going to bear the brunt of the devil's attacks more. Yeah. Right? I think it's going to be more there. So I think that's a good, not to keep one from doing it, but it's a good cautionary statement to be aware of with Lent, with times of prayer and penance, with any attempt to move away from the world, to give oneself more fully to God, is there's probably going to be some backlash.
Absolutely. And that's why, I always think like you see Christians and it seems like, well, they're just as sinful as everyone else.
Yeah,
But
true.
what I didn't understand, yeah, which is true, but you would think that if you're having, when I first started to live a life of grace,
Mm-hmm.
I thought, well, now I've got all these graces,
Yeah.
so it should be easier because I've got the superpower
Right.
to plug into pretty much, God's unmerited gift of grace. And then you realize that the temptations and the attacks and
Get stronger.
as well.
Yeah.
So that's why until you've lived the Christian life, on paper, it's going to look pretty similar. But it's so intensified.
Judge not.
Yeah,
that you be not judged, because we don't know what the other person is going through.
Never should we presume, yeah.
The third and final thing that I wanted to mention, the third sort of commonality across those three, is bread. So the children of Israel survived their journey by means of the manna. It's miraculous bread from heaven.
I like how you said it, sorry.
Manna. That feeds them. And, we see a clue to this in the New Testament. The church has always seen that manna is a prefigurement of the Eucharist.
Right.
And then we look at the story again of Elijah and his time in the desert, and when he wants to give up and he falls asleep, in despair, just ready to give up, the angel awakens him and shows him that by his head there's a loaf of bread, I can't remember if it's one or more, and a jug of water.
Yeah.
Right? And he says, arise, eat and drink, you have a long journey ahead of you. Which, given his point of despair, I can only imagine what Elijah must have thought at that time, like, oh, great, you mean the hard part's just getting started? I've got a long journey ahead of me. But then we get to Jesus, and the devil directly, one of his direct temptations is, if you're the Son of God, make these stones turn into bread, because Jesus is hungry. And Jesus says, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word which proceeds from the mouth of God. And I think this begins to get a little bit into the heart of Lent, because when we first started this episode, one of the things that I said is how easy it is to be distracted by the exterior aspects of Lent, which doesn't mean they're bad. This is human nature. We are always getting distracted by things. No matter how good what the church says we should do is, we, our nature, or the devil are always going to find a way to turn that to our disadvantage.
Right.
And so I think that two of the big things we can fall into with Lent is either it's drudge work, right? I'm just annoyed. Here we go. There's these 40 days again where I can't have a steak on Friday, where I got to give up something. I got to go to church extra times, whatever it is, right? And so we find it annoying. Or the other side is we might even fall into pride. Well, I was super self-disciplined and I gave up all this stuff for Lent and I didn't break down once this year.
And I ate 12 sandwiches at the fish fry.
Yes, exactly. Or thirdly, maybe I should say there's three options. The third one to me, which has been very common in my experience for myself, is, okay, here's the thing I'm going to give up for 40 days. And then the rest of the 40 days are no different than any other 40 days, except that I gave up that one thing, which means I'm missing the point of Lent. It's just like any ordinary 40 days minus one thing.
Yeah.
And what I think is the heart of Lent, or closer to it, is it's not just about what we give up. That is designed to teach us of our mortality, our sinfulness, our idolatry of the things of the world and the flesh that we cling to, that we need so desperately. That's supposed to be getting stripped away. But returning to the story that Jesus says of the man who's had the demon cast out of him, you remember when that demon does come back with the others? It finds the house swept and clean, but empty. So nothing had replaced that influence. And so the demon has, I think it's like 7 more, it says, that worsen himself, and they re-enter the man. So Lent, I think it's not just about sacrifice, giving up things, removing things, but in plunging into the wilderness, it is to remember that this is a time to be strengthened by the bread and the word. And in fact, that those should basically be our main sources of strength. Look at the Desert Fathers. Most of them quite literally did nothing but eat bread, right? They had a very simple diet. And monks, one of their the main parts of their lives is the study and praying of Scripture. Scripture begins to take on a very central role among those who live away from the world. I think it is Thomas à Kempis, at the end of the Imitation of Christ. He says something to the effect, and I can't quote this.
Who did not get buried alive.
Is that a story?
Yeah. There's. I just want to clear this up on air.
Yeah, please do.
They say that he wasn't canonized. A good friend of mine told me this story, thinking it was true, and I've looked into it. There's this whole debate that he wasn't canonized because they dug him up to see if he was incorrupt, and they found scratch marks on the inside of the coffin, and he was trying to get out, which totally, to me, it's just so scary and weird. And
yeah, I don't see how that would keep you from being a saint anyway. If you freaked out a bit trying to get out of a coffin.
Well, not even that. They were saying he despaired, and that's why he didn't get canonized, and the church was so harsh back then, you know. But first off, I don't think that the church, even if they were harsher, would be able to presume that was despair. I think it would be noble if you're alive to try to get out of the coffin. Yeah. But two, there's no historical evidence that he died in that manner at all. There's zero documentation.
I'd never even heard the story before, so this is all news to me.
And then the third thing is, because I mean, like most people, I love the Imitation Christ. He's a duchy, or whatever, proto-duchy at the time. But I think myself, so you know, I
you have a duchy?
You pass them on the left-hand side.
Oh, okay.
Anyways, you know, I really like Thomas à Kempis, so and I love his writing. So I'd hate I hate that myth is perpetuated. Yeah. And what's the third thing that the church would, like you were saying, would never declare that as a reason why someone wouldn't be canonized. And there is a cultus, and his relics are have been moved because all the churches keep closing. So they've been moved 20 times, so I don't know where they are now. But there is a cult, and you know, people do pray for the intercession of Thomas à Kempis. I don't think he's a servant of God or anything yet.
I mean, he's certainly, I think there's every reason to think he was a very holy man, but you know, whether will ever be canonized or not is another
But there's no impediment because he scraped on a coffin, I guess, is what I really want to drive home.
You know, Erik, I have to say, it's not the only reason I like hanging out with you, but it's one of the reasons. I learn something new and really interesting, like every time we sit down and talk. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, same here.
I mean, you may just be making it all up, but I still find it cool.
I just made it. There wasn't even a Thomas à Kempis.
Right. There was no myth about him. You made up the myth to disprove the myth.
Have you ever seen these memes now that they have where it's like, you know, it's making fun of the scholarly source citations, and it's like, cite your source, and just like, I made it up. Another one I've seen is, because ancient historians have done this in the past, the ancient Greeks, I think, you cite your source. It came to me in a dream.
That's awesome.
And like, that's how they figured out like what happened to Atlantis and stuff.
Yeah.
I made it up.
It must be true. It came to me in a dream.
And then the more modern one, I think the Zoomers, the Zennials, whatever you want to call them, the younger generation uses is cite your source. Just trust me, bro. Which I think is also pretty fun.
Just trust us. Thomas à Kempis did not try to scratch his way out of a coffin.
Source, I made it up.
That's right. But he has this comment towards the end of the Imitation of Christ, and I can't quote it now. It's been way too many years, but he says something to the effect
because I rambled so long just now that you forgot.
It's been years, no. Nor do I know if I actually read it or if I heard it read, but it's been a long time ago.
Made it up.
Right. Maybe that whole book I made up in a dream. But he says something to the effect of like, I could not survive were it not for the Eucharist and the Scriptures, which are the bread of God and the Word of God, or something along those lines. Right, so this is what he feeds on. This is like his sole source of life, so to speak. It's the Eucharist and the Scriptures. And I think that may be a really good thing as we kind of try to dig in a little bit to what is the heart of Lent, beyond just these exterior practices. What can we also positively do in Lent? Obviously, the Eucharist is always there for us. We should try to take advantage of it, as frequently as we can. But I would definitely want to add on, immersing oneself into Scriptures.
Absolutely.
And not just like a read through the Bible in a year kind of thing, but maybe like meditate, maybe adopt some Lectio Divina, something along those lines. But yeah, that's kind of, I guess it's kind of the picture I have in my mind is the wilderness, the desert, the wilderness. The world is stripped away. There's nothing left. There's a tremendous battle for the soul going on.
Yeah.
And we're sustained by this miraculous bread and the Word of God. That's kind of the picture in my head.
Yeah.
So.
That's awesome. Just thinking of this too. This is an old Little T tradition, I think, but the 40. So 40 hours in the tomb.
That makes a lot of sense too, because that's preceding the resurrection or
Right.
Easter.
Yeah. So there's 40 hours in between the crucifixion and death of Christ and his resurrection.
You know, I don't know if you remember when we did an episode on Christmas, and we talked a little bit about the dating of Christmas, and we also dispelled one of the myths that it was related to a pagan holiday that's been going around. And then, of course, you just dispelled a myth about Thomas à Kempis while we're talking about Lent. So maybe as we come up on Easter, we can also have a discussion about the supposed Teutonic goddess that it was named after. That there is
Eschator, is that it?
Roughly, that there is no evidence that there ever was such a Teutonic goddess at all. So,
Source? They made it up.
That's right.
They made it up.
And to be fair, too, that's primarily only in English. It's basically some form of Paschal in almost every language, because it refers to the Passover.
Right.
Easter is not the most common way to refer to that feast.
Right. What about the bunny?
Yeah, the bunny just came to me in a dream. This is totally off the topic of Lent. Where did the bunny come from?
That's what we got to find out for the Easter episode.
Okay, because I need to know this. It's the most ridiculous thing. It makes no sense to me.
Well, on that note, I think we should wrap up as a good cliffhanger where we can pick up where we left off.
Yeah.
So coming to you soon in our Easter episode, we're going to explore the origins of the bunny.
The origins?
The origins.
Was it going to be the original or the origins?
Original.
It was like the origins.
Yeah, I was going for both at once.
Right.
The origins.
And can I interrupt before you do your closing?
Sure.
Because I did that once, the whole both at once.
Yeah.
And it was epic. I was at work, and somebody came in, and I said, "Hi, how are you doing?" And they said, "Good." And I have a habit of, there's like a couple of like 60s slang words I use, which are so not cool. And one of them is groovy.
Groovy.
I don't know why I still use that word.
Evil Dead.
And so the person asked me how I was doing. And I went to say, "I'm groovy." And I guess I just felt that it sounded really cheesy. So I changed my mind. In those split second moments where you change your mind, but you've already started a word. And I was just going to say, "I'm great." And what literally came out of my mouth was, "I'm Groot."
I'm Groot.
I am Groot.
I am Groot.
Yeah. I felt that everybody that watches Spirit Spire needed to know that. I don't know why, but I'll let you do your outro now.
All right. So we're going
Back
to
the origins of bunnies.
the origins of the bunny. What was the other thing? The Easter myths.
Easter myths, yeah.
And we're going to say, I am Groot.
I am Groot, yes.
All right. We'll see you next time. Take care.